Welcome to Magical Storybook English Nanny Bedtime Stories, a collection of ancient fairy tales and folklore from around the world. Today's story is from Italy, written by Carlo Collodi and adapted and read by Rehannah Mian. The Adventures of Pinocchio. Chapter 1. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood. It wasn't an expensive piece of wood. Far from it. It was just one of those logs that are put on the fire in the winter to make the cold rooms cosy and warm. Well, one day, this particular piece of wood found itself in the shop of an old carpenter called Mastro Antonio, although everyone called him Mastro Cherry, on account of the tip of his nose being so round, red and shiny, just like a ripe cherry. As soon as Mastro Antonio saw this piece of wood, he was filled with joy. "This is just what I needed," he said, rubbing his hands together. "I shall peel off its bark and use it to make the leg of a table." Then he grabbed his hatchet from the corner of the room. But as he stood with it above his head, about to bring it down on the log, he heard a tiny little voice say, "Please be careful, Mastro Cherry. Please don't hit me hard." Mastro Antonio stood frozen, his arms still above his head. His frightened eyes darted about the room, looking for the person who had spoken, but he saw no one. He looked under the bench and even searched among the wood shavings on the floor, but there was no one. He peeped inside the closet. No one. Finally, he opened the door of his workshop and looked up and down the street. And still no one. "I must have imagined it," he said, laughing and scratching his wig. "It's easily done. Well, back to work once more." And then Mastro Antonio struck the wood hard with his hatchet. "Ow! You hurt me!" cried the tiny voice. Mastro Antonio's eyes nearly popped out of his head with fright. As soon as he had regained his senses, he said to himself, "Where is this voice coming from? There's no one here." Then he looked in wonder at the log in front of him. Could it be that this piece of wood has learned to weep and cry like a child? Oh, I can hardly believe it. Maybe someone is hidden inside it. If so, I'll find him. With these words, he grabbed the log with both hands and began to throw it around the room, listening for the tiny voice to moan and cry. He waited and he waited, but nothing. He tried to convince himself once more that it had just been his imagination, but he remained so scared that he decided to sing a happy song to gain more courage. He put down the hatchet and picked up a plane with which to smooth the wood. But as he drew it to and fro, he heard the same tiny voice giggling. "Stop it! Oh, stop it! You're tickling my stomach!" it laughed. Poor Mastro Antonio was so startled that he fell back onto the floor. At that very moment, there was a loud knock on the door. "Come in," said the carpenter. He had no strength to stand up. The shop door swung open, and a smartly dressed old man entered. His name was Gepetto, although the boys in the neighbourhood used to nickname him Polendina because of the corn-coloured wig that he always wore. "Hello, Mastro Antonio," said Gepetto. "What are you doing on the floor? Looking for mice?" Clambering to his feet and ignoring Gepetto's question, he said, "What brings you here, Gepetto, my friend?" "I've come to you to beg for a favour," answered Gepetto. "I want to make myself a beautiful wooden marionette, one with strings so fine that it will be able to dance and sword fight and turn somersaults. I intend to take it around the world and earn my living while travelling. What do you think?" Suddenly, the tiny voice shouted, "Bravo, Polendina!" Well, on hearing these words, Gepetto was furious. "Why do you mock me by calling me Polendina?" he yelled. Mastro Antonio tried to defend himself, but as he could not say where the voice had come from, the two men began to quarrel. until they eventually remembered that they were good friends and shook hands. When they had composed themselves, Gepetto continued, "My friend, I need a fine piece of wood with which to make my marionette. Do you have one going spare?" Mastro Antonio went to his bench and picked up the piece of wood that had frightened him so much. He was about to give it to his friend when the wood pulled itself from the carpenter's hands and flew towards Gepetto, hitting him hard in the leg. "What is this?" yelled Gepetto. "Is this the way you treat your friends? You almost made me lame." "I swear I did not do it," begged Mastro Antonio. And the two men began to fight again, before eventually shaking hands once more and swearing that they would remain good friends. Then, to Mastro Antonio's great relief, Gepetto picked up the fine piece of wood, thanked him, and hobbled home. Chapter 2. Gepetto lived in a small room on the ground floor of a house, with straw walls and one tiny window. The furniture was simple, just a very old chair, a rickety bed, and a tumble-down table. But little as it was very neat and very comfortable. He had painted a fireplace of burning logs on the wall opposite the door, and a pot of something boiling happily away above it. He had painted clouds coming out of the pot that looked like real steam. As soon as he had taken his coat off, Gepetto began to chop and then carve the wood into the pieces he needed to make his marionette. "What shall I call him?" he thought to himself as he worked. "I'll call him Pinocchio, a name that will make his fortune," he declared. "I once knew a whole family of Pinocchio people. The father was called Pinocchio, and the mother Pinocchia. They had lots of Pinocchio children, and they were all very lucky." After settling on the name for his marionette, Gepetto set seriously to work, making the hair, the forehead, and then the eyes. Imagine his surprise when, as soon as he had finished carving the eyes, he noticed them move from side to side, all on their own. Then he began carving the nose, but as soon as it was finished, it began to stretch, longer and longer and longer. However much poor Gepetto tried to cut it back, it kept growing until he had no choice but to leave it alone until it stopped growing by itself. Next, he carved the mouth, which began to laugh and poke fun at him. "Stop laughing," said Gepetto angrily, but he might as well have been speaking to the wall. "Stop laughing, I say," he roared with a voice of thunder. The mouth did stop laughing, but then it stuck its tongue out. Not wishing to start an argument, Gepetto pretended that he didn't see it and went on with his work. After the mouth, he made the chin, then the neck, the shoulders, the stomach, the arms, and then the hands. As he was about to add the last touches to the fingertips, Gepetto felt his wig being pulled off his head. He looked up and saw that the marionette was waving it about in his hand. "Pinocchio, give me my wig," he insisted. But instead of giving it back, Pinocchio put it on his own head, which almost entirely covered it. "Pinocchio, you wicked boy," cried Gepetto. "You are not even completely carved, and yet you begin life by being impudent to your poor old father. That's very bad, my son, very bad." And he wiped away a tear. But Pinocchio just laughed, and as soon as his feet were finished, he kicked Gepetto on the nose. "What have I made?" Gepetto said to himself. "But I suppose now it's too late." He picked up the marionette and put him on the floor to teach him to walk. Soon Pinocchio was walking all by himself, and when he saw the open door, he leapt out into the street and was gone. Poor Gepetto ran after him, but was unable to catch him, for Pinocchio ran in leaps and bounds, his two wooden feet clattering loudly on the stones of the street. "Catch him! Catch him!" shouted Gepetto, but everyone just stood and laughed at the sight of a marionette running down the street. At last, a carabinier, which is a military policeman, came over to see what all the commotion was about. He grabbed Pinocchio by his long nose and returned him to Gepetto. But Pinocchio threw himself on the ground, crying and refusing to take another step. Gepetto was so angry that he shouted at Pinocchio to get up, but the marionette refused, determined to get his own way. "I won't go home! I won't go home!" he yelled. In fact, he made so much noise that a large crowd gathered. "Poor marionette," called out a man. "I'm not surprised he doesn't want to go home. Listen to how Gepetto shouts at him. He will no doubt beat him horribly." And then the rest of the crowd joined in, protesting at how cruel Gepetto was being, making the poor marionette cry so badly. They yelled so much that the carabinier ended matters by setting Pinocchio free and dragging poor old Gepetto to prison. "Ungrateful boy," cried Gepetto as he sat alone in a cold, dark cell. "To think that I wanted to carve a good, well-behaved son." Now, dear children, what happened after this is an almost unbelievable story, but I will tell it to you anyway. Chapter 3. Pinocchio ran excitedly across the fields and meadows, leaping over brambles and bushes, and not giving a thought to poor Gepetto. Taking one shortcut after another, it wasn't too long before he reached home. The front door of the house was still open, so Pinocchio went inside, locking the door behind him, and then rolling onto the floor to celebrate his escape. "How clever I am!" he laughed out loud. But he stopped when he heard a strange sound. Crack, crack, crack. "Who's that?" asked Pinocchio, more than a little frightened. "It's me," said the voice. Pinocchio turned and saw a large cricket crawling slowly up the wall. "Who are you?" "I am the talking cricket," it said. "I have lived in this room for more than 100 years. "Well," sneered Pinocchio, "as of today this room is mine, so leave now and don't come back." "I will not leave this spot," answered the cricket, "until I have told you a great truth." "Well, hurry up and tell it then," said Pinocchio, "and then you can leave." "Woe to children who refuse to obey the good advice of their parents and who run away from home, for they will never be happy in this world, and when they're older, they will be very sorry." "Oh, sing on, cricket," said Pinocchio, yawning. "For tomorrow at dawn I'll be leaving this place forever. If I stay here, the same thing will happen to me that happens to all the other boys and girls. I'll be sent to school to study, whether I like it or not. I'll have much more fun chasing butterflies and climbing trees. I don't see the point in studying at all." "Poor, silly fool," said the cricket. "Don't you know that if you continue like that, you will grow into a perfect donkey and you'll be the laughing stock of everyone?" "Oh, be quiet, you ugly cricket," cried Pinocchio. But the cricket was wise and had learned not to be offended by people who have no manners. So he continued, "If you don't like going to school, then at least learn a trade so that you can earn an honest living." "I shall tell you something, cricket," said Pinocchio, beginning to lose his patience. "Of all the trades in the world, there is only one that suits me." "And what would that be?" inquired the cricket. "The trade of eating, drinking, sleeping, playing, and wandering around from morning till night. That's the only trade I'm interested in." The talking cricket put on his calmest voice. "Let me tell you, for your own good, Pinocchio, that those who follow that particular trade always end up in hospital or prison." Pinocchio was furious, and he picked up a hammer and threw it at the poor cricket. But the cricket was too fast. He leapt from the wall and out of the window and never returned. As night arrived, an empty feeling in Pinocchio's stomach reminded him that he had not yet eaten. He ran about the room searching for a piece of bread or anything, but he found nothing. Meanwhile, his hunger grew and grew, and Pinocchio began to cry. "The talking cricket was right," he sobbed. "It was wrong of me to disobey father and to run away from home. If he were here now, I wouldn't be so hungry. Oh, how horrible it is to be hungry." Then he ran into the moonlit streets in the hope that somebody in the nearby village might give him a piece of bread. An angry wind was blowing cold, and the trees moaned and creaked as their branches were forced this way and that. Eventually, and quite exhausted, Pinocchio reached the village. The whole place was quiet and seemed to be deserted. Even the houses and stores had their shutters closed. Pinocchio was quite alone. In desperation, he ran to the door of one of the houses and pulled hard on the bell. An old man in a nightcap opened the upstairs window and looked out. "What do you want at this hour of the night?" he called out angrily. "Oh, please, sir, I'm so hungry. Would you be good enough to give me a piece of bread?" The old man stayed silent for a moment and then said, "Wait a minute, I'll come right back." After a minute, the man returned to the window and shouted, "Stand under the window and hold out your hands." Pinocchio moved to the window, but then felt a shower of ice-cold water pour down onto his wooden head. "Now go away and don't wake me up again," yelled the old man. Poor Pinocchio returned home, soaking wet and tired from hunger. As he no longer had any strength, he sat down on a little stool and put his 2 feet on the stove to dry them, and then he fell sound asleep. But while he slept, his wooden feet began to burn. Slowly, very slowly, they blackened, and eventually they turned to ash. Chapter 4. At dawn, Pinocchio was woken by the sound of loud knocking at the door. "Who is it?" he called, yawning and rubbing his eyes. "It is I," said a voice. "Gepetto." Pinocchio stood up, but immediately fell to the floor. "Father, help me! I cannot get to the door. My feet are gone." Gepetto, angry and thinking that Pinocchio was lying again, climbed through the window of the house and was just about to give his marionette son a stern telling off when he saw him lying on the floor. At this sad sight, all his anger disappeared. "My dear little Pinocchio, how did you burn your feet?" "I don't know, Father," he sobbed. "Last night was terrible, and I shall remember it as long as I live." Pinocchio explained what had happened and that he was still so hungry, so Gepetto handed him the 3 pairs that he had in his pocket while he continued his tale. "I want a new pair of feet," complained Pinocchio as soon as he had finished. "And why should I make you new feet?" replied Gepetto. "So that you can run away again?" "Oh, I won't, Father, I promise," sobbed Pinocchio. "From now on, I'll be very good." "Boys always promise that when they want something," answered Gepetto. "But I mean it," said Pinocchio. "I'll go to school every day and I'll study hard and do well in life." "Boys always say that too when they want their own way," said Gepetto. "But I'm not like other boys," begged Pinocchio. "I'm better than all of them and I always tell the truth. I'll learn a trade and I'll look after you in your old age." Gepetto felt his eyes fill with tears, and his heart softened when he saw that Pinocchio was so unhappy. And so, without uttering another word, he took out his tools and carved Pinocchio 2 new wooden feet. "Yippee!" cried Pinocchio, jumping with joy. "Now I shall go to school. Oh, but won't I need a new set of clothes?" Gepetto had no money at all, so he made his son a suit from flowered paper, a pair of shoes from the bark of a tree, and a tiny cap from a piece of dough. Pinocchio ran to look at his reflection in a bowl of water, and he felt so proud. "I look like a gentleman," he said. "But now I need an ABC book from the bookshop." "But I have no money," sighed Gepetto, turning out his trouser pockets. But then he had an idea. He jumped up from his chair, and putting on his old coat, he ran out of the house. He returned a while later, shivering but carrying the ABC book in his hand. Pinocchio understood what his father had done. "Father, you sold your coat." Unable to hold back his tears, he wrapped his arms around his father's neck and hugged him tightly. As he walked to school, Pinocchio began thinking of all the wonderful things he would do when he got there. "I'll learn to read today, and tomorrow I'll learn to write, and the day after tomorrow I'll do arithmetic. And then I'll be so clever, I'll earn lots of money, and with the very first pennies I make, I'll buy father a new coat, for he surely deserves it." His thoughts were broken by the sound of pipes and drums in the distance. He stopped to listen. It sounded like a parade, and it seemed to be coming from the tiny village down by the shore. "Oh, well, now I want to follow the music. Oh, but I should go to school. Oh, what should I do?" In that moment, Pinocchio made a decision that was to change his life forever. "Well, I think that today I'll follow the drums, and I'll go to school tomorrow. After all, the school will still be there then." Before he had even finished thinking, he was running down the street towards the music. He arrived in the middle of a large square, which was filled with people queuing in front of a brightly painted wooden building. Drummers and pipers were playing outside to draw up a crowd. "What's in there?" Pinocchio asked the little boy next to him. "Read the sign and you'll know," said the boy. "I'd like to read it, but I can't today, not until I've been to school." "Oh, really?" laughed the boy. "It says, 'Great Marionette Theatre,' and it'll cost you 4 pennies to go inside." "Oh, I really want to see the show," cried Pinocchio, "but I have no money." A peddler who was standing nearby had been listening to their conversation. "I'll give you 4 pennies in exchange for your ABC book," he said. And without giving a thought to poor Gepetto, who was sitting at home shivering with cold, having sold his coat to buy that book for his son, Pinocchio handed it to the man, took the pennies and ran inside the theatre to watch the show. The place was packed out and Pinocchio was very excited. Suddenly, the stage curtain began to rise and the crowd cheered and the performance started. 2 marionettes whose names were Harlequin and Pulcinella put on a fine show, reciting stories, dancing and pretending to sword fight. The audience had so much fun that some of them were crying with laughter. After a few minutes, and without any warning, Harlequin suddenly stopped acting and pointed into the crowd. "Look, it's Pinocchio!" "Pinocchio!" screamed Pulcinella. This drew the attention of all the other marionettes who were backstage. "Our brother Pinocchio!" they cried as they rushed onto the stage to see. "Pinocchio, come to me!" shouted Harlequin. "Come to your brother!" At such a loving invitation, Pinocchio leapt on the stage. They all embraced, shrieking with joy. But the audience became very angry that the show had stopped and began to yell loudly. The noise brought the theatre director out of his room. When he stepped out onto the stage, the crowd grew silent, and the poor marionettes trembled with fear, for the director had the most terrifying appearance. His beard was black as pitch and stretched down to his feet, showing only his wide mouth filled with yellow fangs and red eyes that glowed like hot coals. In his hands he was swishing a long whip back and forth, causing everyone to duck. "Why have you brought disruption to my theatre?" he boomed at Pinocchio. While the marionettes continued the show, Pinocchio told the director his story and how he had let Gepetto down as he had so wanted to see the show. The director felt sorry for Gepetto, so he gave Pinocchio 5 gold pieces to take back to him. Pinocchio was overjoyed and thanked the kind man 1,000 times. He said his goodbyes to each of the marionettes and happily set off home. Chapter 5. He had barely walked half a mile when he happened to pass a lame fox and a blind cat on the road. By how they were acting, it was obvious that they were good friends. "Good morning, Pinocchio," said the fox as he passed. Pinocchio was most surprised at the fox's familiar greeting. "How do you know my name?" he asked. "I know your father well," replied the fox. "I saw him yesterday standing at the door of his house, shivering in his shirt he was, and trembling with cold." "Oh, poor father," said Pinocchio. "But he won't suffer any more. I've become rich." And he held out his hand to show the fox and the cat the gold pieces that the theatre director had given him. The fox's eyes widened. "And may I ask what you're going to do with all that money?" "First of all," answered Pinocchio, "I'm going to buy a fine new coat for my father, one made of gold and silver with diamond buttons, and then I'll buy another ABC book for myself. I'm going to school to study hard." "Oh, but look at me," said the fox. "I wanted to study, and look, it made me lose a paw." "And look at me," said the cat. "Because I wanted to study, I lost the sight in both of my eyes." At that moment, a blackbird flew down and perched on the fence beside them. "Pinocchio, do not listen to their bad advice. If you do, you'll be sorry." The cat, who was only pretending to be blind, leapt at the bird and it flew off. "Poor blackbird," said Pinocchio to the cat. "Why did you do that?" "I did it to teach him a lesson," said the cat, licking its paw. "He talks too much. Next time, he will keep his words to himself." They walked on for a while, sharing stories about how unlucky they all were and how unfortunate life had been for each of them, until the fox suddenly stopped in his tracks and, turning to Pinocchio, said, "Do you want to double your gold pieces?" "What do you mean?" "Do you want 1,000 gold pieces instead of your miserable 5? "Well, yes, but how?" asked Pinocchio, his eyes widening. "It's very easy," replied the fox. "Instead of returning home, come with us." "Where will you take me?" "To the city of Simple Simons, of course, where fortunes are made." Pinocchio thought for a while, but then said very firmly, "No, I don't want to go. I'm nearly home and my father's waiting for me. Oh, how worried he must be that I've not yet returned. I've been a bad son." "Well then," said the fox, "if you really want to go home, then off you go. But you'll be sorry. You'll be turning your back on a fortune." "A fortune?" repeated the cat. "Why, tomorrow your 5 gold pieces could be 2,000. 2,000, repeated the cat. How pleased Gepetto would be if you returned home truly rich. "But how can that possibly be?" asked Pinocchio. "I'll explain," said the fox. "Just outside the city of Simple Simons, there's a place called the Field of Wonders. If you were to dig a hole there and bury 1 gold piece and water it, and then leave it overnight, in the morning you'd find a beautiful tree loaded with gold pieces." "Oh my goodness!" cried Pinocchio. So if I were to bury my 5 gold pieces, how many gold pieces would I find tomorrow? Why, you would find... The fox muttered to himself, pretending to work it out on his fingers. 2,500 new sparkling gold pieces. 2,500? Squealed Pinocchio, dancing for joy. Oh, think what I could do with 2,500 gold coins. I shall keep 2,000 for myself and give you two the other 500 as a gift to say thank you. A gift for us? Cried the fox, pretending to be insulted. Please no, we only work to help others. Oh, what good people, thought Pinocchio. And forgetting about his father, the new coat, the ABC book, and all his good intentions, he said to the fox and cat, Please take me to the Field of Wonders. Chapter 6. As they walked, it began to grow dark, and soon only the moonlight lit their path. The fox and the cat walked ahead, while Pinocchio dawdled behind, thinking of all the things that he was going to buy. Out of nowhere came a cree noise, interrupting his thoughts. And when Pinocchio looked up, he saw the talking cricket on the trunk of a tree. Oh, what do you want? Said Pinocchio. To give you some words of advice, replied the cricket. Return home and give the gold pieces to your poor father. He is weeping because he does not know where you are. Tomorrow my father will be a rich man, replied Pinocchio. Young boy, do not listen to those who promise you overnight wealth. As a rule, they are usually either fools or criminals. Go home. But I want to go to the Field of Wonders, protested Pinocchio. Remember, continued the cricket, that boys who insist on having their own way sooner or later come to ruin. You speak such nonsense, scoffed Pinocchio. Goodbye, cricket. Then he ran on to catch up with the fox and the cat. Farewell, poor Pinocchio, said the cricket sadly, and may heaven preserve you from these criminals. We boys really have it bad, muttered Pinocchio, kicking stones along the path and feeling most sorry for himself. Everyone tries to control us. But just then he heard a rustling sound in the leaves behind him. He turned around and saw 2 large black shadows lurking in the trees. They were wrapped from head to foot in black sacks. Pinocchio quickly hid the gold pieces under his tongue and tried to run away, but he had hardly taken a step when he felt one of the figures grab his arm. Your money or your life, it growled. Pinocchio pulled the hand away from him and felt that it was furry, like a cat's paw. Pinocchio ran and ran for a good hour, and the criminals never gave up chasing him. When he was almost too exhausted to go on, he saw a white cottage gleaming among the forest trees. He reached the door and knocked as hard as he could. Help! Help! He shouted, but nobody answered. He could hear the criminals drawing near. Suddenly, a window opened and a lady looked out. She had blue hair and she seemed to be glowing with a pale blue light. Oh, please let me in, cried Pinocchio. I'm being chased. He didn't get to say any more because 2 powerful hands grabbed him and shook him to try and release the coins from his mouth. But Pinocchio refused to give in, and so the criminals hung him upside down from a tree by his feet and said that they would wait. After some hours, they grew tired, and so they left, leaving Pinocchio hanging there. We'll be back tomorrow, said one of them. Perhaps a night in the dark will make you change your mind about handing over the coins. But the next day came and went, and the criminals did not return. Pinocchio hoped that some good soul would happen along and rescue him, but for days he saw no one. And as night turned to day, and then back to night, Pinocchio could think of nothing but poor Gepetto. Oh, father, dear father, if only you were here." These were Pinocchio's last words before he fell asleep, exhausted and sick. Later that day, the lady with the blue hair passed by and saw the marionette hanging from the tree. Taking pity on him, she clapped her hands 3 times, and down flew a large falcon. "Quar, quar, what do you command, my charming fairy?" asked the falcon, bowing his head respectfully. For she was a spirit who had lived in the forest for more than 1,000 years. The fairy asked the falcon to cut Pinocchio's ropes with its beak, which he did. Then she rang a bell, and a coach made of glass rolled towards her from the stables. It was drawn by 100 pairs of white mice, and inside were linings as soft as whipped cream and chocolate pudding. And together they transported Pinocchio to the fairy's house. After a few days' medicine and care, Pinocchio began to get better, and soon he was strong enough to tell the good fairy his story, and of the criminals who had tried to rob him. "Where are the gold pieces now?" asked the fairy. I lost them," lied Pinocchio, for he had them in his pocket. But as he said the untrue words, his nose began to grow. "Where did you lose them?" asked the fairy. "Nearby, in the woods," he answered. At this second lie, his nose grew even longer. The fairy tried to hide her smile. "Oh, then you mustn't worry," she said. "If you lost them in these woods, then we shall find them, for everything that is lost in these woods is always found. Let us go and look for them." Pinocchio began to panic. Now I remember," he said. "I didn't lose the gold pieces. I swallowed them when I drank the medicine." At this third lie, his nose became so long that when he turned his head, it hit the wall. The fairy started laughing. "Why are you laughing at me?" cried Pinocchio. "I am laughing at your lies," replied the fairy. "Who says I'm lying?" People who lie, Pinocchio, often think that they're being clever, but to others their lies are as obvious as the nose on their face. Pinocchio felt so ashamed that he tried to leave the room, but his nose had become so long that he couldn't get out of the door. Crying as though his heart would break, he sobbed and sobbed, but the fairy showed him no pity, for she was trying to teach him a lesson about how lies bring nothing but sadness to everyone, and in Pinocchio's case, loneliness. When she was satisfied that Pinocchio had learned his lesson, the fairy clapped her hands and a woodpecker flew in through the window. It settled on Pinocchio's nose and pecked away until it was the same size as before. "How good you've been to me, my fairy," said Pinocchio, drying his eyes. "I'm so grateful to you, but I would like to see my father again." "Your father has been sent for," she smiled. "He'll be here before nightfall." "Really?" cried Pinocchio joyfully. "Then, my good fairy, if you're willing, I'd like to go and meet him halfway. He's already suffered so much for my sake." "Of course," said the fairy, "but be careful not to get lost. Stay on the woodland path and you will find him." Pinocchio said goodbye and ran off towards the woodland path. As he passed the giant oak tree, he stopped still, for he thought he heard a rustle in the bushes behind him. He was right. He turned around and there stood the fox and the cat. "Oh dear, Pinocchio," cried the fox, hugging him. "What are you doing here?" "I'm going home," said Pinocchio. "My father will be here at any moment." "And your gold pieces?" continued the fox. "I still have them here in my pocket." "Why didn't you sow them in the field of wonders?" said the fox. "You could have had 2,000 by now." 2,000, repeated the cat. "Come, let us take you." "I'll go with you some other time," said Pinocchio. "I must meet my father now." "Some other time will be too late," said the fox. "The field of wonders has been bought by a very rich man, and after today it will no longer be open to the public. It will only take half an hour to get there. You can sow your coins and harvest your 2,000 a few minutes later. Then return home very, very rich." Pinocchio hesitated for a moment, remembering the advice of the good fairy Gepetto and the talking cricket. But then he shrugged his shoulders and said, "Okay, let's go." They walked and talked for half a day at least, until at last they came to the city of Simple Simons. "Where's the Field of Wonders?" asked Pinocchio, growing tired. "Be patient, it is only a few more steps away," said the fox. Just outside the city wall was a field, which looked just like any other field. And when they stepped onto the soil, the fox declared, "Here we are." "Here?" asked Pinocchio, a little confused. Yes, now dig a hole and place the gold pieces inside it." Pinocchio did as he was told. He dug the hole, put the gold pieces into it, and then covered them over with soil. "Go over to that brook and bring back some water," continued the fox. Once more, Pinocchio did as he was told, and when he returned with a shoe full of water, the fox told him to sprinkle it over the soil that was covering the gold. "Now you must go into the city of Simple Simons and wait. And when you return in 20 minutes, there will be a plant here with branches filled with gold pieces." "Gold pieces," repeated the cat. Pinocchio was beside himself with excitement. He thanked the fox and the cat many times and promised them each a beautiful gift. "Oh, we don't want any of your gifts," answered the two rogues. "It is enough for us that we have helped you to become rich with little or no trouble at all. For this alone we are as happy as kings." They wished Pinocchio good luck and waved their goodbyes. Pinocchio could hardly wait, and he paced the city streets until the 20 minutes were up. Then he ran back to the Field of Wonders thinking, "What if instead of 2,000 I find 5,000 or 100,000? Oh, I'll build myself a beautiful palace with 1,000 stables filled with 1,000 wooden horses to play with, a cellar overflowing with lemonade and ice cream soda, and a room filled with candies and fruits, and cakes and cookies." These thoughts kept his brain busy until he eventually reached the Field of Wonders, and there he stopped. He looked left and he looked right, but there was no plant with branches filled with gold. In fact, there was no plant at all. He went to the place where he had buried the gold pieces and found only an empty hole. The coins were gone. Chapter 7. A parrot who had been watching Pinocchio from a tree squawked, making him jump. "The fox and the cat returned and took the gold pieces, and then ran away as fast as the wind." Pinocchio's mouth dropped. He didn't want to believe that the parrot was telling the truth, so he kept digging until the hole was as big as he was, but there were no gold coins. Every penny was gone. He ran back to the road that led to the fairy's house, not once stopping to rest. "Oh, what have I done?" he said to himself. "My poor father, I've been so selfish and ungrateful. But from now on, I'll be good." Eventually, he reached the place where the fairy's house had stood, but it was no longer there. It had completely vanished. "Oh, my fairy, my dear fairy, where did you go?" he sobbed. "Oh, don't leave me." A large pigeon that was flying past him said, "Cuckoo, cuckoo. Tell me, little boy, do you happen to know of a marionette called Pinocchio?" "Why, I'm Pinocchio," he answered. At this, the pigeon flew swiftly down to the ground. "Pooh, then you know Gepetto," said the pigeon. "He's my father, my poor dear father. Where is he?" "Cuckoo, I left him 3 days ago by the shore. He was building a little boat so that he could go and look for you on the sea. The poor man has been searching for you on land for the last 4 months. I have been helping him." "Oh, please will you take me there?" asked Pinocchio anxiously. "Cuckoo, cuckoo, of course, get on my back," said the pigeon. Pinocchio climbed upon the pigeon's back and held onto its neck, then off they flew. They flew all through the night, and finally, at daybreak, they arrived at the seashore. But it was too late. Gepetto's boat had already set sail and was far out to sea. Pinocchio called out to his father, but it was no use. He could only stand and watch as the wind got up and the little boat disappeared beneath the waves. In a panic, Pinocchio dived into the water, shouting, "I'll save you, father!" Pinocchio swam all night. But what a horrible night it was. It poured with rain, it hailed, it thundered, and the lightning was so bright that whenever it flashed, it turned the night into day. If Pinocchio hadn't have been made of wood, he would have been pulled under the water, but luckily for him, he was. At dawn, the storm calmed, and Pinocchio could see in the distance a long stretch of sand. It was an island. With the last bit of strength he had left, he swam towards it. After resting, he decided to walk across the island to see if there was any sign of life. How surprised he was to discover a small, busy town, filled with people going about their business. Pinocchio was so hungry and thirsty now that he begged anyone he saw for food and water, but no one would help. Everyone just said, "Rather than begging, why don't you go and earn some money and buy your own food?" But one lady did take pity on the poor marionette. "You poor thing," she said. "Come with me and I'll make you some food." Pinocchio wolfed down his meal, and after he had finished, he looked up at the lady and gave a cry of surprise. "Oh, my fairy, my kind fairy, is that you? Please tell me it is." "How do you remember me, Pinocchio?" said the fairy. "When you left me, I was a young girl, but now I'm a woman." "I would never forget you," sobbed Pinocchio. "But how did you grow up so quickly?" "Well, that's a secret," answered the fairy. "Oh, please tell me. I so want to grow up too. I'm tired of being a marionette." "It's very simple," replied the fairy. "Try to act like a well-behaved child. That is how you grow up." "From now on, I'll be different," said Pinocchio. "I promise. I want to become a good boy and be a comfort to my father." "Where is he? Will I ever see him again?" "I'm sure of it," smiled the fairy. "Your sorrow makes me see that you have a kind heart. There is always hope for boys with kind hearts. Until you find Gepetto, I will look after you." "Oh, thank you," cried Pinocchio, jumping with joy. "Remember, Pinocchio," continued the fairy sternly, "whether a man is rich or poor, they should do something in this world. No one can find happiness without a purpose." These words touched Pinocchio's heart. He lifted his eyes and said, "I'll work, I'll study, I'll do everything you tell me to, fairy. I want to become a real boy, no matter how hard it is. If I work really hard to deserve it, do you promise me that that will happen?" "Yes, I promise," said the fairy. "But now it is up to you." Chapter 8. The next morning, bright and early, Pinocchio said goodbye to the fairy and set out for school. How the children laughed to see a marionette walking into the classroom. But as the days passed into weeks, they forgot that Pinocchio was a marionette. He studied hard and he made lots of friends. The problem was that some of these friends were rascals who cared nothing for study or purpose. Seeing Pinocchio become closer to these boys, the teacher would warn him to stay away from them. And even the good fairy would say, "Take care, Pinocchio. Bad friends will make you lose your love for study, and someday they will lead you into trouble." But Pinocchio would just shrug his shoulders and say, "That won't happen." Well, one day it did happen. As Pinocchio was walking to school, some of these boys ran up to him and said, "We're not going to school today. Are you coming?" "No, I'm going to school," answered Pinocchio. "Don't worry about school. "We'll just go tomorrow," said one of the boys. "But what will the teacher say?" said Pinocchio. "Oh, he'll probably grumble as usual," replied the boy. "He's paid to grumble all day long. What does he care?" "You're right," said Pinocchio. "Let's go." So, with their books tucked under their arms, the boys dashed across the fields, laughing heartily. That night, Pinocchio made his way back home, feeling very ashamed. "Oh, how shall I ever face my good fairy?" he thought. When he reached the house, he let himself in, making sure that he didn't wake the fairy. And then he fell sound asleep on the sofa. When he woke, the fairy was sitting beside him. "I forgive you," she said gently, "but you must be careful not to get into mischief again, or magic will not show itself to you, Pinocchio, and you will not become a real boy." Pinocchio promised once more to study and to behave, and he kept his word for the rest of the year. He passed all of his examinations, and his report was so good that the fairy said to him, "Tomorrow your wish will come true, Pinocchio. You will no longer be a marionette. You will become a real boy." Pinocchio was beside himself with happiness, and they decided that they would have a party to celebrate. And so Pinocchio went to give out the invitations. Now, among all his friends, there was one who Pinocchio liked most of all. His name was Romeo, but everyone named him Lampwick, due to the fact that he was tall and thin. Lampwick was both the laziest boy in the school and the biggest mischief maker, but Pinocchio loved him dearly. So on this day, he went straight to Lampwick's house to invite him to the party. But on the way, he spotted Lampwick sitting on the grassy verge, leaning against a farmer's wagon. "What are you doing there?" asked Pinocchio, running up to him. "I'm waiting for midnight so that I can go," said Lampwick quietly. "Go where?" "Far, far away from here." "Haven't you heard the news?" said Pinocchio excitedly, ignoring his friend's sadness. "Tomorrow I end my days as a wooden marionette. I'm to become a real boy, just like you and everyone else." "Well, may it bring you luck," replied Lampwick, unimpressed. "Will you be at my party tomorrow?" asked Pinocchio. "I told you I'm going away tonight." "Where are you going?" "To a real country," said Lampwick. "The best in the world. Somewhere better." "What's it called?" asked Pinocchio with interest. "The Land of Toys. Why don't you come?" "I? Oh no," said Pinocchio. "I have to go to school." "School? Oh, you're making a big mistake, Pinocchio," said Lampwick. "In the Land of Toys there are no schools, no teachers, no books. The Land of Toys is just play and fun from morning till night, every single day. We'd be happy there, wouldn't we?" Said Pinocchio, nodding his wooden head. "That kind of life would suit me perfectly." "Are you coming then?" said Lampwick. "Oh, no, I've promised my kind fairy that I'll be a good boy, and I want to keep my word. Oh, look, the sun's setting and I must get home before nightfall. Goodbye, Lampwick, and good luck to you." "Will you just wait with me for 2 more minutes, my friend?" asked Lampwick. "Your fairy might scold you, but she'll soon get tired and stop. If you wait until midnight, you'll get to see the wagon to the Land of Toys." "I've waited too long as it is," cried Pinocchio. "The fairy will be so worried." Then he hesitated before saying, "Are you really sure that there are no schools in the Land of Toys?" "Not one," replied Lampwick. "And I won't ever have to study?" "Never, ever, ever." "It sounds wonderful," sighed Pinocchio. "And you're sure that every day is a play day? There are no work days?" "Very sure," said Lampwick. "But it's late. Don't you need to go home and get ready for school tomorrow? And your fairy will scold you now." "Oh, I'll let her," scoffed Pinocchio. "She'll soon get tired and stop." By now the night had drawn in and the sky was black. All that could be seen was a small light flickering in the distance. "There it is!" cried Lampwick, jumping to his feet. The strange wagon pulled up silently beside them. Its wheels were covered with straw and rags so that it could not be heard as it moved from town to town. Pulling it were 12 pairs of donkeys, all the same size but different colours. Most were a mixture of browns, greys and blacks, but unusually some had yellow and blue stripes, just like a school uniform. But the strangest thing of all was that those 24 donkeys were wearing lace-up boots, just like the boys wore. The wagon was packed tightly with boys of all ages, piled on top of one another and shouting joyously, for they knew that soon they'd be in a land where there were no schools, books or teachers. The driver, a large man with a round face like an apple, asked, "Are you coming along with us to the land of toys, my dears? I warn you there's no more room inside the wagon, it's full." "Never mind," answered Lampwick, "I'll sit next to you." And with one leap Lampwick jumped up onto the top of the coach. "What about you, my love?" asked the man, turning towards Pinocchio. "Are you coming with us or are you staying here?" Pinocchio remained quiet for a moment before saying that he would stay behind and go to school and be good. "Come with us!" shouted the boys. "You'll always be happy." Pinocchio sighed deeply and finally he yelled, "Make room for me, I'm coming with you." The boys cheered as Pinocchio climbed onto the back of one of the donkeys and the wagon wheels began turning once more. If only they had known the dreadful things that were about to happen to them. As the donkeys galloped along the stony road, Pinocchio was sure that he could hear a very quiet voice whispering to him. "Poor silly boy," it said. "You are happy now, as you have done exactly as you wished, but soon you will be sorry." Pinocchio was very frightened, and he looked around to see where the voice was coming from, but he saw no one other than Lampwick and the others far behind him. They galloped on, but after a mile or so, the same faint voice appeared again. "A day will come when you will weep bitterly," it whispered. "Boys who turn their back on their education so that they can spend their time on nonsense and pleasure will sooner or later come to grief. Remember, you will weep bitterly, as I weep now, but then it will be too late." At these words, Pinocchio looked down at the face of the donkey he was riding and saw that it was crying real tears. When he pointed it out to the coach driver, he told Pinocchio to ignore it, and so he did. The donkey remained silent for the rest of the journey, and eventually Pinocchio fell asleep. The coachman woke the boys in the morning to tell them that they had finally arrived at the land of toys. The boys rubbed their eyes and then cheered loudly at the marvellous sight. It was just like being at the most gigantic fun fair in the world, and it was made up entirely of boys. The oldest were about 14 years of age, and the youngest around 8. There was shouting and music, and everywhere groups of boys were gathered, some playing marbles and some playing hopscotch or football, while others rode bicycles or wooden horses. The boys piled off the wagon and disappeared into the crowds. Pinocchio wandered off alone until someone pulled him into a game of blind man's buff. A moment later he was in a game of tag. There were boys playing circus, somersaulting and walking on their hands, while others danced and sang songs. It was pure pandemonium. Pinocchio walked on through the streets and town squares, which were filled with theatres overflowing with boys from morning till night. On the wall of the houses, written in charcoal, were the words, "Hurrah for the land of toys! No more adults, no more school!" The new arrivals wandered everywhere and could not have been happier. With entertainment and parties all hours of the day, the weeks passed by like lightning. "Oh, what a beautiful life this is," said Pinocchio whenever he bumped into Lampwick. "So was I right or was I wrong?" laughed Lampwick. "And to think that you didn't want to come. True friends count, don't they?" "It's true, Lampwick, it's true," replied Pinocchio. "I'm really happy, and it's all because of you." 5 months passed by, and the boys continued playing from morning till night, not knowing that their happiness was soon to end, and that they were about to pay a terrible, terrible price. Chapter 9. One morning, Pinocchio awoke to a great surprise, but it was not a nice surprise. It was one that made him feel very unhappy. Something felt strange and heavy about his head. He raised his hands and found that during the night he had grown what felt like 2 long fairy ears. They must have been 10 inches long at least. He went in search of a mirror. Unable to find one, he filled a bowl with water and looked at his reflection. To his horror, he saw that he had indeed grown 2 long ears. In fact, they were 2 beautiful donkey ears. Pinocchio began to cry and scream, but the more he shrieked, the longer his ears grew. The noise brought out a dormouse from a hole. "Oh!" she said when she saw him. "You have the donkey fever." "What's the donkey fever?" cried Pinocchio. "It means that within 2 or 3 hours you'll be a real donkey, just like those that pull the carts to market." "Oh, what have I done?" sobbed Pinocchio. "My dear boy, there's no point in crying. Tears now are useless. Didn't you know that sooner or later all lazy boys turn into donkeys? What is done cannot be undone, so you must learn to live with it." "But the fault is not mine, Dormouse," protested Pinocchio. "It's all Lampwick's fault. I told him that I wanted to be good, but he made me come to the land of toys with him. I should never have abandoned my good fairy. If I'd have gone home, I would have been a real boy by now." Then he ran to the door, determined to give Lampwick a piece of his mind. But before he did, he took a large cotton bag from the shelf and put it over his ears. But when he eventually found Lampwick, his anger turned to sorrow, for Lampwick too had a large cotton bag on his ears. He was even more distressed than Pinocchio. "Let me see your ears," said Pinocchio. "Oh, well, if you show me yours," replied Lampwick. So they counted to 3 and then both pulled off their bags. When they saw each other's long furry ears, they both burst out laughing. They laughed and laughed until they nearly cried. But all of a sudden, Lampwick stopped laughing. He tottered from side to side, almost falling over. "Help me, Pinocchio, help me!" "What's the matter, Lampwick?" panicked Pinocchio. "Oh, help me! I can't stand up!" As Pinocchio rushed to help his friend, he too stumbled around helplessly. "I can't either!" he cried, and his laughter turned to tears. And then both of them fell onto all fours, and they began running and jumping around the room. As they ran, their arms turned into legs, their faces lengthened into snouts, and their backs became covered with long grey hairs. And if this wasn't bad enough, they each then felt a tail appear. They were so overcome with shame and grief. They tried to cry out, but as the Dormouse said, what was done could not be undone. And so, instead of moans and cries, the 2 boys just let out a hee-haw. The noise alerted the driver of the wagon who had brought them there. He knocked loudly on the door. "Open up! Open up, I say!" When they opened the door, the coach driver looked at both Pinocchio and Lampwick and smiled. "Ah, good job, boys," he said, rubbing his hands together. "You made fine donkeys. You've had months of play and no work, and now it's time to pay." He combed them both until their coats shone like glass. Then he put a bridle on them and took them to market to sell them. Lampwick was bought by a farmer, and Pinocchio was sold to the owner of a circus who intended to teach him to do tricks for his audiences. I do not know what happened to Lampwick next, but I do know that Pinocchio met with great misfortune. "You'll help me earn lots of gold, do you hear me?" said the circus master, dragging Pinocchio onto his wagon. "I'll train you to jump and bow and dance a waltz, and to stand on your head." Pinocchio endured 3 long months of beatings before he was finally so broken and frightened that he did what the circus master demanded. Pleased with his new act, the circus master put posters up all over town advertising "Pinocchio, star of the dance." That night, the circus tent was filled to overflowing and there was not a spare seat to be found anywhere. Boys and girls of all ages and sizes laughed joyfully, impatient to see the famous Pinocchio donkey dancing. The circus began, and the children cheered to see the clowns, acrobats and performing animals. When the first part of the performance was over, the circus master appeared in a black coat and long leather boots, and shouting in a loud, pompous voice, made the following announcement: "I, your most humble servant, now present the greatest, the world-famous Pinocchio!" At this, the audience broke out into cheers and applause, and when the famous Pinocchio appeared, the applause grew into a deafening roar. He was handsomely dressed with a new bridle of shining blue leather and 2 white camellias tied to his ears, while ribbons and tassels of red silk adorned his mane. The master bowed to the audience and then turned to Pinocchio and said, "Ready, Pinocchio? But before you begin your performance, remember to salute to the audience." Pinocchio obediently bent his 2 knees to the ground, and he stayed kneeling until he heard the familiar and terrifying crack of the ringmaster's whip next to him. The loud booming voice then ordered him to walk. Pinocchio lifted himself onto his 4 hooves and then trotted around the ring. He could hear the sound of the audience cheering and shouting. A few moments passed before the ringmaster shouted, "Quick step!" and Pinocchio obediently changed his step. "Gallop!" Pinocchio galloped. A shower of applause and cheers greeted the donkey as he rose to his feet, a tear running down his cheek. Pinocchio lifted his head to the audience and raised his eyes, hoping that someone would rescue him. And what did he see? A lady with bright blue hair was sitting in the front row, looking at him sadly. "Oh, my fairy! My own dear fairy!" he shouted. But instead of words, all Pinocchio could do was bray. "Hee-haw! Hee-haw!" he said over and over again. The children laughed and the ringmaster cracked his whip over Pinocchio's legs. Pinocchio closed his eyes with pain and was then filled with grief when he looked up again and saw that the fairy was gone. Hearing the ringmaster's loud voice booming for him to bow, Pinocchio did. "Bravo, Pinocchio!" shouted the ringmaster. "Now show the audience how gracefully you can jump through these hoops." Pinocchio attempted to jump through the hoops 2 or 3 times, but he was so tired and sad that he tripped and fell to the floor in a heap. When he got up, he was lame, and so his part in the show was over. Although the crowd shouted, "We want Pinocchio! We want the donkey!" no one saw Pinocchio again. Seeing that his donkey's leg was injured, the ringmaster said to the stable boy, "That donkey's no good to me now. Take him to the sea and throw him in. Afterwards I'll turn his coat into a drum." The stable boy did as he was told, and he tied Pinocchio to a piece of rope and threw him into the water. But instead of drowning, Pinocchio the donkey turned slowly back into a wooden puppet, and he untied the rope and swam away as fast as he could. Chapter 10. After swimming for a long time, Pinocchio saw up ahead a large rock in the middle of the sea. It was white as marble. As he swam nearer, he saw a little goat standing on it. She was bleating and beckoning Pinocchio to come over. There was something very strange about that little goat. Her coat was blue, and she seemed to glow. "My fairy!" shouted Pinocchio, swimming towards her. And he had almost made it when suddenly a gigantic sea monster stuck its head out of the water, its mouth huge and gaping wide, showing 3 rows of enormous gleaming teeth. Pinocchio was scared half to death, and he tried to swim away, but the monster was too fast for him. "Faster, Pinocchio! Swim faster! I beg you!" bleated the goat loudly, but it was too late. Pinocchio felt himself being dragged backwards in the water and then down into the darkness of the monster's belly. All around him was pitch black. He listened for a few moments but heard nothing but the gurgling and breathing of the monster's lungs. "Help! Help! Oh, please won't somebody help me?" he shouted as he tripped over bones and half-digested food. Pinocchio tried to find his way back to the monster's mouth, but he had no idea which direction to go. He wandered through the darkness for what seemed like hours, and he was beginning to lose hope when suddenly he noticed what looked like a faint light flickering up ahead. At first he wondered whether his eyes were playing tricks on him, but he carried on walking towards it anyway, and the further he went, the clearer the tiny light shone. Imagine his surprise when he found that the light was coming from a candle stuck inside a glass bottle, which was placed on a small table which was set for dinner. Next to it, on a small wooden stool, was a little man who looked very sad. At this sight, Pinocchio was filled with such great happiness that he wanted to cry. "Father! Father! Oh dear father, I found you at last!" he cried, throwing his arms around Gepetto. "I'm so sorry." "Am I dreaming?" sobbed the old man, rubbing his eyes to see better. "Are you really my dear Pinocchio?" "Yes, I am, father, yes, I am. Oh, please forgive me." Then he asked, "How long have you been down here, father?" "For 2 long, tiring years, my Pinocchio, which have felt like centuries. On the day that I set sail to look for you, my little boat broke apart in a storm, and I was swallowed by this monster. I have lived down here ever since, surviving on fish that the monster swallowed, and making a home from the debris of shipwrecks." Then Pinocchio went on to tell Gepetto about everything that had happened to him. When he had finished and they'd gathered their emotions, Pinocchio said, "We must try to escape." "Escape? How? I cannot swim, Pinocchio," said Gepetto. "Then climb on my shoulders and I will carry you safely to the shore," he replied. Without speaking another word, Pinocchio took the candle and led Gepetto back through the body of the sea monster. They followed the fresh air and were so relieved to finally see the stars in the night sky beyond the huge columns of teeth. On tiptoe they crept over the monster's tongue until they were standing at the edge of the sea. Gepetto climbed onto Pinocchio's shoulders and they were just about to dive into the water when the monster suddenly sneezed. And as it sneezed, Pinocchio and Gepetto were thrown on their backs and sucked right back into the creature's stomach. But they didn't give up. "We must try again, father. Don't be afraid," said Pinocchio. And with these words, he took his father by the hand once more, and they climbed up the monster's throat for a second time. And this time they dived into the water and started to swim. The moon shone onto the surface of the water, lighting their way, while behind them the monster continued to sleep soundly. Pinocchio swam through the night trying to find land, but in the freezing water, Gepetto slept as he became colder and colder. Have courage, father. We'll be okay, Pinocchio said reassuringly. We'll soon be safe on land. But secretly, Pinocchio was beginning to panic, as there was no land in sight. As the waves continued to batter them, Pinocchio began to get weaker and weaker, and he sank lower and lower into the vast sea. Suddenly, out of nowhere, an enormous tuna fish popped its head up. "Thank you for saving my life," it said. "I didn't want to become a dinner." Pinocchio's confusion was written across his face, and so the tuna went on to explain. "I followed you out of the monster's stomach. Here, climb on my back and I'll carry you both to dry land." Gepetto and Pinocchio were so relieved and so grateful to the tuna, and as soon as they reached the shore, Pinocchio said, "Dear friend, you saved my father. I don't have enough words to thank you." Then he bent down and kissed the fish on its cheek before they said their goodbyes, and it plunged back into the sea. In the meantime, the sun had started to rise and day was dawning. Pinocchio offered his arm to Gepetto, who was so weak now he could hardly stand. "Lean on my arm, father. We'll walk very slowly, and if we feel tired, we can rest by the wayside." "Where are we going?" asked Gepetto. "To look for a place where they will be kind enough to give us a bite of bread and some straw to sleep on." They hadn't gone very far when they saw two rough-looking individuals sitting by the roadside begging. It was the fox and the cat. Chapter 11. Dear children, you would hardly have recognised them. They looked so miserable. The cat, after pretending to be blind for so many years, had really lost his sight, and the fox had grown ragged and thin. "Oh, Pinocchio," cried the fox in a tearful voice, "can you help us? We are old, tired and sick." "Sick," repeated the cat. "You are false friends," answered Pinocchio. "You cheated me once, but you won't cheat me again." "Believe us, we are so sorry," begged the fox. "We are truly poor and starving now." "Starving," repeated the cat. "If you are poor, you deserve it," said Gepetto, and he and Pinocchio calmly walked by. Further on down the road, they came across a tiny cottage built of straw, and they knocked at the door. "Who is it?" said a little voice from within. "A poor father and son," answered Gepetto. "We are in need of a little food and a roof for the night." "Turn the key and the door will open," said the voice. Pinocchio turned the key and they went inside. But there was no one there. "Where are you?" cried Pinocchio. "Here I am, up here," said the voice. They both looked up to the ceiling, and there on a beam sat the talking cricket. "Oh, my dear cricket," said Pinocchio. "Now you call me your dear cricket, but don't you remember when you threw your hammer at me and tried to kill me?" "You are right, dear cricket. I'm so sorry. Punish me all you wish, but please help my father." "I will help you both," said the cricket. "I simply wish to remind you that you must be kind and respectful to others if you want people to be kind and respectful to you when you're in trouble." "You are right again, little cricket. You are more than right, and I shall remember the lesson you have taught me. But tell me, how did you come by this pretty cottage?" "This cottage was given to me yesterday by a little goat with blue hair," answered the cricket. "A goat with blue hair? Oh, where is she now, cricket?" asked Pinocchio. "I don't know." "When's she coming back?" "I don't know," repeated the cricket. "Yesterday she left sobbing, saying that you had been eaten by a monster and that she would never see you again. She said that because of this, she could never return." "Oh, so the little goat really was my good fairy," cried Pinocchio. And then he turned to Gepetto and saw how exhausted he looked, and so he made a bed of straw for him and helped him to lie down. When Gepetto was settled, Pinocchio said, "Tell me, Cricket, where can I find a glass of milk for my poor father?" 3 fields away from here, said the Cricket, lives Farmer John. He has some cows and will give you some milk. Pinocchio ran all the way to Farmer John's house and asked him for a glass of milk. "A full glass of milk will cost you a penny," said Farmer John. "You must pay me first." "But I have no penny," answered Pinocchio. "Well, if you have no penny, then you'll have no glass of milk," said Farmer John. Pinocchio was so upset, and he was just about to walk away when Farmer John said, "Perhaps we can make a deal. Do you know how to draw water from a well?" "I can try," answered Pinocchio. "Well then, do you see that well over there? If you bring me 100 buckets of water, I'll give you a glass of warm, sweet milk." Pinocchio agreed and set about pulling up the buckets of water. When he had drawn 100 buckets, the farmer thanked him and said, "You did well, thank you. Until today my donkey drew the water for me, but now the poor animal is dying." Pinocchio felt very sad. Remembering he'd been a donkey himself, he asked if he could go to the stable to see it. The farmer agreed and showed him the way. Once he was through the stable door, Pinocchio could see a little donkey lying on a bed of straw in the corner. "He's sick from hunger and too much work," cried Pinocchio. And then something made him take a closer look. "I know this donkey," he said, bending down and stroking its face. "Lampwick." The donkey opened its weary eyes and whispered, "Pinocchio." And then he closed his eyes and died. "Oh, my poor Lampwick," said Pinocchio, sobbing bitterly. "Why do you feel so sorry for my little donkey?" asked the farmer, who was standing by the stable door. "He was my friend." "Your friend? We went to school together," said Pinocchio. "You had donkeys in your class?" laughed Farmer John. "What a strange school that must have been." He walked away laughing and returned a few minutes later holding a glass of milk. Pinocchio took the milk and returned to his father. Chapter 12. From that day on, Pinocchio got up every morning just as dawn was breaking and went to the farm to draw water. And every day he returned back home with a glass of warm milk for his poor father. And a few days later, he began making and selling baskets to earn even more money. And Pinocchio found time to study in the evenings to prepare for his return to school. One day, Pinocchio announced, "I've saved enough money to buy us some new clothes, Father. I shall go into the village today." Gepetto laughed kindly, and Pinocchio ran out of the house singing. As he opened the gate, he heard a small voice calling his name. He looked down and saw that the voice had come from a large snail, which was crawling out of the bushes. "I have news of the fairy with the blue hair," said the snail. "My fairy? Please answer me quickly, beautiful snail. Where is she? Is she near? Oh, may I see her?" The snail answered calmly, "My dear Pinocchio, the fairy is lying ill in a hospital. She has become sick with worry and has no money to buy food with." "Oh, my dear little fairy," cried Pinocchio, "I have 50 pennies in my pocket. I was going to buy some clothes with them, but please, snail, please take them and give them to my fairy." "What about your new clothes?" replied the snail. "Oh, what does that matter? I would sell these rags if they would get me more money for her. Please hurry, and if you come back in a couple of days, I'll have even more money for you." To Pinocchio's surprise, the snail suddenly sprouted legs and began to run like a lizard. When he got home, Gepetto said, "Where is your new suit, Pinocchio?" Not wanting to tell Gepetto that he had given his money away, Pinocchio said, "Oh, I couldn't find one to fit me. I shall look again another day." That night, Pinocchio made double the number of baskets to sell at the market the next day. Then he went to bed. As he slept, he dreamt that his blue fairy was standing over him, smiling and happy. He dreamt that she bent down and kissed him on the forehead before saying, "Bravo, Pinocchio. You have proved that you have a kind heart. Children who take good care of their parents deserve praise, even if they are not always well behaved. And I will forgive you for all your mischief. Keep being kind, Pinocchio, and you will be happy." At that very moment, Pinocchio woke from his sleep. He felt different. He looked at his hand and saw that it was the hand of a real boy. He ran to the mirror and saw the bright face of a real boy with blue eyes, brown hair and smiling lips looking back at him. He looked around the room. It looked like Gepetto's house, only now it was beautifully furnished. In the corner was a chair with a new suit and a hat and a pair of shiny shoes laying across it. In the pocket of the suit were the 50 gold coins that had been returned to him by the good fairy, and a letter saying, "Thank you for your kindness, Pinocchio. Remember to be kind to others, and your goodness will spread throughout the world." He ran out of the bedroom and into the next room, and there sat Gepetto, looking years younger and wearing a suit of fine new clothes. He was hard at work carving a lovely picture frame and decorating it with flowers and leaves and animals. He looked so content. "Father, father!" he cried, throwing his arms around his father's neck. "What has happened?" "Our beautiful house is all your doing, my dear Pinocchio," answered Gepetto. "What have I to do with it?" asked Pinocchio. "When naughty boys become good and kind, they make their homes happy and bright too. Our behaviour holds a lot of power over the happiness of others." "Oh, my head was made of wood, father," said Pinocchio. "I'm so much happier being good. I intend to make you happy too." Then he noticed the large wooden marionette leaning against a chair. And after a long, long look, Pinocchio said to himself, "How ridiculously I behaved as a marionette. I'm so happy that I've become a real boy."